So we looked at this last time where we said the body volume in log millimeter cube along the historical evolution of life forms on Earth has often depended on the amount of free oxygen in the atmosphere. There was one big jump here and there was another big jump here just before the Precambrian. And there are many theories as to why higher levels of oxygen allowed bigger animals or species to evolve, and then we have reached the current level of oxygen in the atmosphere and we have certain scale of animals. Of course, the current limitation on how large a species can get often goes to other ideas, not just oxygen, but about allometric scaling, because if a heart is pumping or digestive system is supplying nutrients, whether it's in a tree or a blue whale, each extremity of the species has to be supplied at a certain rate, at certain speed to maintain the functioning of the species. So there is a limitation in that sense just from the network of energy supply and supply of oxygen and blood and so on for how big the species can get. But the idea here we expressed was that the amount of carbon locked up in the biological or organic form is much smaller than the amount of carbon that's available, or reservoirs of inorganic carbon are much larger. And the idea was that in that sense the role of the biological pump or organic carbon in the long-term regulation of climate probably was not large. Because there is a fairly rapid negative feedback between, let's say, increased photosynthesis, production of organic matter, and its respiration and uptake of oxygen. So the oxygen balance on long time scales seems to indicate that maybe it's the carbonate silicate cycle and not the organic carbon that regulates climate on long time scales. But we will see in the next podcast that this is now debated as well, that the carbonate versus silicate weathering has to be reconsidered potentially, because the role of the biology in producing carbonate may be underestimated. So we can start with this figure showing again the history of oxygen. The faded red curve shows classical two-step view of atmospheric evolution, while the blue curve shows the emerging model of atmospheric partial pressure. Sorry, I think I goofed this up here. The right axis is showing the present atmospheric level and how the fraction of previous levels of oxygen compared to the as a fraction of the present atmospheric level. And here we are looking at estimated partial pressure of oxygen in atmospheres. Okay, so arrows here denote possible whiffs of oxygen late in the Archean, when the earliest photosynthesis would have started with the primitive species, Archaea. Their duration and magnitude are poorly understood. An additional frontier lies in reconstructing the detailed fabric of state changes in atmospheric PO2, such as occurred in transition from the late part of the Archean to the early part of the Proterozoic, and from late Proterozoic to the early Phanerozoic. So there were two jumps here which are locked up in various evidences like paleosols and so on, that can be used to infer the jumps in oxygen, but there is of course some uncertainty there. Sorry about this caption here, but you can go to this paper and read the caption more properly. But anyway, this kind of corresponds to the two jumps we saw in the body mass of the species. In general, you don't see such a figure of global oxygen budget. You see such figures very commonly for carbon budget, carbon cycle for phosphorus, for nitrogen, and so on. So here we are looking at one of the rare oxygen balance models. This is not on the long time scale, but it is related to the anthropogenic time scales here. The annual average global oxygen budget from 1990 to 2005. The green arrows denote the production from land vegetation and outgassing from the oceans. The red arrows represent consumption by fossil fuel combustion by humans and livestock respiration, fire, and the residual in the budget. So you have land production here, ocean outgassing here. You can see that the land production dominates. Oxygen in the ocean is obviously dependent on photosynthesis as well. But the oxygen profile in the ocean is as expected high near the surface because of the exchange with the atmosphere and the photosynthesis in the so-called euphotic zone of the ocean, where there is enough light for photosynthesis and nutrients are sufficiently available. But there are a lot of species distributed in the vertical in the ocean, and you get an oxygen minimum zone at around 1 kilometer, and then the profile depends on the thermohaline circulation and so on and so forth. So wildfires take up 5.87. Here we are looking at gigatons of oxygen per year, compared to the numbers in the atmospheric decrease of 21.23 gigatons per year. This is 5.87 here. Livestock respiration amounts to about 2.24. Fossil fuel combustion is taking up 25 or so gigatons oxygen per year. Obviously these numbers will have uncertainties, which is not shown here. Human respiration is 3.09 gigatons, and to close the budget there is a residual of 2.69. Oxygen depletion is now well known, corresponds to increased population, livestock, and of course fossil fuel burning, which is a massive number here. And the balance is also looked at this way, where we are looking at oxygen flux in gigaton oxygen per annum, and there is the human. So these are the negative numbers, which are the sinks of oxygen, and there is the source of oxygen. So ocean and land together are contributing a small amount of oxygen during this time, but the sink is mostly the fossil fuel, with additional contributions from fire and human and livestock respirations. The projected decline in oxygen in gigaton per annum is shown here based on models. Obviously one has to be careful, and the shading here corresponds to the model spread estimated from models. So the temporal variation of global O2 budget from 1900 to 2100. The temporal variation of O2 here, consumption and producing processes are shown. The shade below the shade below zero denotes the processes that remove oxygen from the atmosphere, and the shade above obviously processes that produce oxygen. And these are the model spread here shown in the models that are used to make climate projections. Okay, so obviously these are estimates, but there is no doubt at all that we're going to keep depleting oxygen. And physically speaking, there is also the impact of oxygen on atmospheric radiation balance processes, temperatures, humidity, and so on. But considering the amount of oxygen that's available as a reservoir in the atmosphere, this is not a serious concern, but obviously one has to think about our continuing impact on oxygen. But in our context of evolution of carbon cycle and the regulation of climate on long time scales, we must remember that biological role in carbon cycle and climate regulation may not be as small as is typically assumed. It's always assumed and stated that the fraction of organic carbon is small, and oxygen balance requires that the organic carbon is respired to maintain balance. So the photosynthesis, production of organic matter, oxygen consumption go hand in hand, and that feedback is negative, so the biological role remains small. But we will see in the next podcast that the carbonates that are typically assigned to silicate weathering may be not as accurate as assumed before. So we will see what the arguments are in terms of the role of weathering regulation in long time scales for carbonate versus silicate weathering reactions. Okay, so looking at oxygen in this context is important, and then we will move on to evolution of carbon cycle, climate, and climate regulation by the carbon cycle.